a late-night patrol car, a quiet southern street, and two officers who thought they could get away with humiliating the wrong woman. What started as a so-called routine stop turns out to be anything but because this woman. She's no ordinary citizen. She's a decorated Marine, a leader, and the last person you want to cross when you're hiding behind a badge. What follows is more than confrontation. It's a collision of power, prejudice, and the kind of justice you don't see coming. So sit back, settle in, and get ready, because this story unfolds like a storm, and by the end, you'll be asking yourself, what would I have done? Let us know in the comments what time you're listening, where you're tuning in from, and if you've ever witnessed someone stand tall in the face of injustice. And hey, if this kind of real, powerful storytelling speaks to you, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Let's dive in. It was the kind of quiet southern morning that makes you forget the world ever held trouble. The Spanish moss hung low over the oaks like nature's own slow exhale, and the sun hadn't yet burned the dew off Naomi Harlan's front lawn. She stood barefoot on the cracked concrete porch of her father's old house, a chipped blue watering can in hand, listening to the distant clatter of a woodpecker tapping at a telephone pole. The house smelled like cedar and dust, and memory her father had built it with his own hands, and every board, every nail seemed to whisper stories she wasn't ready to hear just yet. She wore a loose gray sweatshirt and worn jeans, her short-cropped silver hair tucked under a faded Marine Corps cap that looked older than the weeds in the driveway. Her back ached faintly, a reminder of too many years in body armor, too many jumps, too many missions where time was short and fear was never allowed to show. This morning, though, she was just a woman watering hydrangeas, reclaiming a little corner of peace after a lifetime of war zones and forward operating bases. The air was thick with humidity and the scent of magnolia, and for a moment it felt like maybe, just maybe, the hard years were behind her. She didn't hear the patrol car at first. It slid into the cul-de-sac like a whisper turned sharp quiet, but insistent with purpose that didn't belong on such a still morning. When the red and blue lights flickered against the white siding of her neighbor's house, Naomi turned slowly, blinking against the sudden glare, her watering can tipping just enough to soak her foot. Two officers stepped out before the engine even fully died, their movements stiff with tension, their hands already near their belts. One of them, tall and tightly wound, barked without preamble, "Ma'am, step away from the house." Naomi blinked, caught between confusion and instinct. "I live here," she said, simply, her voice low and steady. "Is there a problem?" "You match the description," the shorter officer added, circling to her side like she was something wild that needed cornering. "We got a call about loud music and a disturbance at this address." "There's been no music," Naomi said, eyes narrowing. "And no disturbance unless you count me watering flowers." The taller one stepped closer, close enough that Naomi could see the crease in his forehead, the tension behind his jaw. "I said, step away from the house." His voice sharpened as he pointed toward the mailbox. "We've had issues in this neighborhood. Don't make this harder than it has to be." She raised her hands slowly, not in surrender but in restraint. "Sir, with respect, I'm Gunnery Sergeant Naomi Harlan, United States Marine Corps, retired. This is my family home. I have my ID inside if you'd just let me." He didn't wait. The slap came fast, open-palmed and sudden, and it snapped her head to the side like a marionette cut from its strings. The watering can clattered against the steps, and for a moment the only sound was the trickle of water into the dirt. Naomi staggered back, the taste of copper blooming on her tongue, the world narrowing into a pinpoint of disbelief. "You don't get to pull that military crap with me," the officer growled, grabbing her wrist. "You people think that gives you a pass. Think again." The cuffs bit into her wrists as he forced her to her knees, face scraping against the brick porch her father had laid by hand. Her breath came in short, silent bursts, not from pain, but from fury buried beneath decades of discipline. She could hear the neighbors' now doors creaking open, whispers carried across manicured lawns, someone recording on their phone, but no one spoke, not yet. Not until the shorter officer muttered, "Dispatch says she's clear, boss. No priors. Says the house is in her name." There was a pause, the kind that feels like it stretches longer than it has a right to. Then the taller one said, without looking at her lucky break, "But next time, ma'am, maybe answer the door like a normal person." They left her on the ground, the cuffs unclasped but still warm against her skin. Naomi sat there, one knee in the dirt, breathing through her nose hands, shaking, not with fear but with the weight of something else, something heavier than anger. It was betrayal, the kind you don't scream about, the kind you fold deep into your chest and let it burn slow like coals under ash. Back inside the house felt smaller, the walls too close, the air too thick. She walked straight past the kitchen down the hallway to the cedar-lined closet where her uniform hung in plastic. It was pressed and perfect, untouched since the last memorial service she'd attended. As she slid her fingers over the polished metals pinned to her chest plate, she didn't think about revenge. She thought about standards, about the oath she'd taken and the one those men had clearly forgotten. She thought about her father's voice, old and worn, telling her when she was 10 years old, "There's dignity in knowing who you are when no one else does." In the mirror, her cheek was already blooming purple, a cruel arc beneath her eye. She reached up gently, touched the swelling, then let her hand fall. For the first time since she came home, Naomi Harlan wasn't just a woman rebuilding a life. She was a soldier again, staring down a new battlefield in a place she thought was finally safe. The day hadn't changed, but something in her had. And this time she wasn't backing down. Inside the house, Naomi moved like someone walking through water, slow, heavy, unsure where the current might pull next. Her feet made no sound against the hardwood, but her breath felt loud in her chest, each inhale reminding her that the slap hadn't knocked the wind out of her lungs, just the air out of the moment. The living room was still exactly as she'd left it, curtains pulled halfway, a dusty framed photo of her father on the mantel, and her duffel bag slouched open by the front door like a tired soldier leaning against a wall. She didn't stop to unpack. Didn't bother with the melting groceries in the back seat of the car. She went straight to the hall closet, past the shadowy reflection of herself in the hallway mirror, past the whispering silence that now seemed to fill every corner of the house. She reached for the sliding door and paused, hand hovering just above the old brass handle, the kind her father had insisted on installing himself, real metal, he used to say, not that cheap stuff they use nowadays. The closet was cedar-lined, the scent of it rushing out as soon as the door creaked open, earthy and sharp like the inside of a footlocker after deployment. There, hanging at attention under a plastic garment bag, was the one thing she had never boxed up or let the moths have. Her dress blues, Marine Corps issue, tailored to fit her frame 15 years ago when her back was straighter and her eyes still held the edge of combat readiness. Naomi peeled the plastic down slowly, revealing the deep navy fabric with the red piping that had become part of her second skin over 2 decades of service. The medals were pinned in tight formation: good conduct, national defense, a purple heart, and just above them the Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal with a V for valor. She stared at them for a long moment, her fingers hovering just above the silvered surface, like she was afraid to touch it too soon. It wasn't vanity that brought her here. It wasn't some hunger for glory or recognition. It was something deeper. A need to remember who she was before 2 men in pressed polyester tried to reduce her to just another body on the sidewalk. She heard the front door creak again, whined this time, not a visitor, and turned slightly, still clutching the collar of the uniform. Her jaw ached where the officer's hand had landed, but it wasn't the sting of impact that lingered. It was the look in his eyes, that cold certainty, that practiced dismissal, that split-second calculation that she didn't belong here on this porch, in this house, in this skin. She hadn't seen that look in years, but she recognized it instantly. It was the same expression worn by village warlords and third-world thugs, by those who'd never served but thought they understood power. She took the uniform down gently, laying it across the back of the couch with reverence, then walked into the kitchen where the kettle was still warm on the stove. As it whistled to life, she pressed a dishcloth filled with ice against her cheekbone, feeling the bruise forming beneath the skin like a slow tide creeping inland. She didn't cry, not because she was too strong or too proud, but because there was nothing left to drain from her. The well of shock was already dry. All that remained was stillness, and underneath that, resolve. The phone rang once, then stopped. A robocall, probably. Or maybe a neighbor checking in and thinking better of it. She didn't answer, didn't move. Just stood there, one hand gripping the edge of the counter, the other resting gently on the bruised side of her face. It occurred to her that she hadn't been in uniform in almost 5 years. She hadn't needed to be. Retirement had come like a quiet mercy after decades of high alert. But now, looking at the fabric stretched across the back of the couch, she felt something return, something she hadn't realized she'd been missing. Clarity. She walked back to the living room and ran her fingers along the seams of the jacket, inspecting it like an old comrade returned from the field. The metals gleamed under the sunlight that slipped through the blinds, catching on the curved edges of the ribbons like fireflies at dusk. She remembered a time when each one had meant something precise, an act, a moment, a line crossed or held. Now they meant something else entirely. They were evidence of who she was, of where she'd been, of what she was willing to do again if it came to that. "I didn't ask for this," she murmured aloud, voice soft but unwavering. "But I'm not backing away from it either." No one responded. The house held its breath with her. Outside, the neighborhood was still, the air hot and thick with the weight of summer. Somewhere down the street, a lawnmower started up its buzz, blending into the ambient hum of a world that had gone on spinning, completely unaware that something had shifted inside one woman on one small porch. She placed the uniform back in the closet, not to hide it, but to protect it. She wasn't going to wear it yet. Not today. Not out of anger. Not out of pride. But she needed to know it was ready, that she was ready. That if this ever became something more than a slap on a quiet Georgia morning, she could meet it with her head high and her legacy intact. And as she closed the closet door with a quiet click, Naomi Harlan exhaled, long, steady, and controlled, like a soldier who had just reloaded her spirit after taking fire. The next morning, Naomi stood in the doorway of her late father's study, the smell of old tobacco and yellowed paper still lingering like a faded hymn. The light came in low through the slats in the blinds, dust motes dancing quietly in the shafts, as if time itself had slowed to watch her. She hadn't set foot in that room since the funeral hadn't dared to disturb the neat order of her father's world, where every book had its place and every file folder wore his tidy handwriting. Now, with the echo of last night's slap still buzzing somewhere deep inside her chest, she found herself drawn back to that quiet space where he used to sit for hours, sipping coffee, reading the news, and pretending not to worry about the places she'd been deployed to. She crossed the room slowly, her fingers brushing along the bookshelf where their framed photo still sat her in uniform, him in his Sunday best, both of them smiling like they didn't know how few pictures they'd end up taking together. She picked it up and stared for a long moment at the faint crease in his cheek, the half-smile he always gave when he was proud, but too stubborn to say it out loud. "You'd have hated this town by now," she whispered. "Too many people hiding behind smiles and fences pretending everything's fine." The floor creaked beneath her as she turned toward the desk, opening the top drawer and pulling out the leather-bound journal her father had kept for years. She wasn't sure what she was looking for, maybe a message, maybe just the feel of his presence, but the words inside were steady, measured the same way he used to speak. He'd written once during her second deployment, "You'll fight 100 enemies in your lifetime, but the ones that wear a badge and a grin are the ones you watch closest. They smile at you while planning where to cut." She closed the journal gently, her breath catching for just a second, not from grief but from the eerie sense that he had known this would come somehow. She went to the kitchen next, filled a small thermos with black coffee, then stepped out onto the back porch where the air was cooler and the trees kept the sun at bay. The breeze carried the scent of honeysuckle and damp soil, and for a moment it calmed the storm that had been building in her since yesterday. She sat in the old rocking chair her mother used to favor, resting the cup on the worn armrest, and pulled out her phone. Her thumb hovered over the contact list before settling on a name she hadn't dialed in over a year, Thomas Bishop. He answered on the second ring, his voice gruff with sleep and age. "Naomi, I'll be damned. Where have you been hiding?" "I'm not hiding," she replied quietly, staring out at the yard. "I came home. Trouble found me anyway." There was a long pause, then the low scrape of a chair. "Talk to me." She told him everything from the moment the cruiser pulled up to the sting of the slap, from the silence of the bystanders to the cold weight of the cuffs around her wrists. Thomas didn't interrupt. He just listened the way old Marines do, without judgment, without unnecessary questions, just a steady, grounded presence on the other end of the line. When she finished, there was another pause. Then he said, "They don't know who they put their hands on." "That's not the point," Naomi said, voice tightening. "It shouldn't matter who I am." "No," he agreed. "But it does. And now you've got choices." She knew what he meant. She could let it pass, bury it deep, chalk it up to ignorance or bad training or small-town nerves. Or she could reach for the part of herself that had spent a lifetime navigating chain-of-command politics and battlefield diplomacy and use it to hold people accountable who'd grown too comfortable abusing power. "Do you still talk to Eleanor at the senator's office?" she asked. Thomas's chuckle was quiet, almost proud. "She still owes me 3 favors and a bottle of scotch. I'll make a call." "Not yet," Naomi said. "I need to think." I need to remember who I am outside of the noise. Fair, he said, but don't wait too long. They're counting on your silence. When the call ended, Naomi sat for a while, the mug cooling in her hand, her eyes tracing the edges of the yard, where her father once planted tomatoes and her mother chased fireflies with an old mason jar. The breeze rustled the trees, lifting the hem of her t-shirt, cooling the sweat along her spine. She wasn't angry in the way people expect. It wasn't rage that filled her, but something more deliberate, an understanding that the world hadn't changed as much as she'd hoped. That the uniform might have earned her respect on the battlefield, but here at home on a front lawn in Georgia, it was invisible beneath her skin. Still, she hadn't put it on for them. She'd kept it clean for herself, for the woman she used to be before compromise and weariness threatened to make her forget why she'd ever served in the first place. The ribbons, the stripes, the brass buttons, they weren't armor anymore. They were memory, they were proof, and if she chose to wear them again, it wouldn't be for ceremony. She stood slowly, stretching the stiffness from her back, and looked out across the fence line where the neighbor's flag hung limp in the still air. Red, white, and blue, but faded from years in the sun. Much like the ideals it was meant to represent, she thought. Not gone, just dulled. Waiting for someone to lift it again high and true. Naomi walked back inside the screen door, clapping shut behind her, and placed the journal on the kitchen table. The silence returned, but this time it felt different, less like absence, more like space. Like room for something to take root again, something old and strong and necessary. She didn't know exactly what her next step would be, but she knew it wouldn't be backward. Not anymore. And as the morning light stretched across the floor like a promise not yet made, Naomi Harlan stood still in her father's house, surrounded by memory framed by silence, and fully aware that the war might be over, but the duty was not. 3 days after the incident, Naomi found herself back behind the wheel of her pickup, the old truck humming steadily beneath her like a worn-out dog that still knew how to run. The back roads outside Savannah twisted like vines, each turn bordered by trees thick with Spanish moss and secrets, and as she drove, she let her fingers drum softly against the steering wheel, not out of nerves, but because silence had never sat comfortably with her thoughts. She wasn't heading anywhere specific at first, just moving, following instinct, letting the sound of gravel under tires and the warm wind through the open window keep her anchored in something real. The slap, the cuffs, the officer's breath against her ear, it all lingered not as images anymore, but as weight, and Naomi had always believed in facing weight head-on. She stopped in front of the county records office, a squat brick building with faded green shutters and a flagpole that squeaked every time the breeze touched it. The parking lot was half full, mostly dusty sedans and government trucks, and Naomi stepped out straightening the collar of her shirt as she made her way to the glass door. Inside, the air smelled like old carpet and toner, and the only sound was the faint clicking of a keyboard behind the front desk. A woman with short curls and a badge reading, Terry looked up and smiled politely. "Help you find something, ma'am." Naomi offered a nod, her voice calm but firm. "I'd like access to citizen complaint records, especially for the Riverbend precinct." Terry hesitated, blinking as if that wasn't a request she heard every day. "Do you have a reason or a case number?" "No case," Naomi said. "Just curiosity." The woman tilted her head slightly, the smile thinning at the edges. "You might need a FOIA request for that." Naomi reached into her wallet and quietly placed her retired military ID on the counter. She didn't push it forward or wave it around, just let it sit there, a quiet reminder of the life she'd lived before returning to this town. Terry glanced at it, then back at Naomi, and after a moment she stood. "Wait here. I'll see what I can do." 10 minutes later, Naomi was seated at a wooden table in the back corner of the room, a manila folder in front of her, and a notepad open beside it. The papers were copies, some smudged, some watermarked, but the names were clear and the patterns were clearer still. Dozens of complaints across 3 years, all against the same 2 officers who had pinned her to her porch, Cole Avery and Trent Foster. The charges ranged from unnecessary force to verbal intimidation, with most filed by black residents in the Riverbend and Glenview neighborhoods. Almost all were marked investigated, insufficient evidence, or closed without recommendation. None had resulted in disciplinary action. She read slowly, each report pulling her deeper into the rhythm of a system built not to protect but to exhaust. No wonder people stopped filing. The paperwork alone felt like a barrier, and the language suspect displayed non-compliance reasonable force employed was the same cold script she'd seen used in overseas interrogation summaries. sanitized, stripped of humanity, buried in bureaucracy. She circled 5 names, 5 complainants who had reported incidents eerily similar to her own, and made a plan to track them down. But first, she needed a perspective outside her own. The next morning she made her way to Bethel Baptist Church on the south edge of town, where Reverend Samuel Green had been shepherding his congregation since before Naomi joined the corps. The sanctuary was quiet when she entered the wooden pews glowing amber under the morning light, and she found him in the back room, organizing hymnals, his long frame bent slightly from decades of standing for others. "Naomi Harlan," he said with a gentle smile. "Now that's a name I haven't heard out loud in too long." "I didn't plan to come back this way," she said, easing into a chair across from him. But things changed. He studied her face, the slight discoloration still lingering beneath one eye, and he didn't ask what had happened. "Sometimes home calls us back not for comfort," he said, "but for work." She slid the folder across the table. "This isn't just about me, Reverend. It's happening to people all around here. Same officers, same excuses." He opened the file, read in silence, then sighed the kind of deep knowing exhale that only comes from someone who's watched cycles repeat like rainfall. "I've heard these stories in the church basement, after services, during food drives. Folks too tired to make it public but too bruised to stay quiet." "Why haven't they come forward?" Naomi asked, even though she knew the answer. "Because they know what silence buys them," he said. "And they're not sure what speaking out will cost." Naomi nodded, feeling the truth of that settle into her chest. "What if someone else does the speaking?" Reverend Green closed the folder and looked at her not with surprise but with understanding. "Then you'll need allies, real ones, the kind who don't flinch when the blowback starts." "I've got a few names," she said. "I'm going to talk to them." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, his fingers steepled in thought. "Be careful, Naomi. You may be right, but being right doesn't mean being safe." "I didn't come back to be safe," she replied. He smiled, a little sad, a little proud. "Then I'll make sure the church doors stay open. For them. For you." As she stepped back out into the morning, the sun had climbed higher, casting long shadows across the cracked sidewalk and the overgrown grass edging the parking lot. Naomi paused, taking in the stillness around her, the quiet hum of cicadas, rising in the distance, the scent of summer baked into the air. Her father used to say that change never starts loud. It starts in whispers, in footsteps, in one person, refusing to let things stay the way they are. She opened the truck door, slid behind the wheel, and unfolded the list of names again. 5 people, 5 stories, 5 chances to turn a pattern into a reckoning. And for the first time in days, her hands didn't shake. She knew what came next, and she was ready for it. The morning of the town council meeting dawned with a sky the color of worn denim, thick with the kind of low clouds that promised heat more than rain. Naomi stood at her bedroom mirror in silence, fastening the last button on her Marine Corps dress blues, with hands steady from decades of routine, though her heart thudded with the quiet insistence of something more personal than protocol. The ribbons were all in place, each one aligned with precise care, but it was the weight of the silver eagle on her collar, the insignia of a gunnery sergeant, that reminded her she wasn't stepping into that room as a victim. She was going as a veteran, a citizen, and a woman who had nothing left to lose except her silence. In the hallway, she paused by the photographs lining the wall, her parents on their wedding day, her mother holding her in a blanket by the fire, and farther down, a faded snapshot of Naomi in uniform standing between 2 Marines lost in Afghanistan. Their faces were young and full of promise, and as she traced one frame with her finger, she whispered, "This one's for you too." The municipal building sat across from the county library, a squat beige structure that looked more like a DMV than the seat of local power, but inside the room buzzed with the sort of uncomfortable energy that comes from small towns trying to look the other way and failing. The council chamber wasn't large, just 3 rows of chairs, a dais with 7 officials, and a podium facing them like a witness stand dressed up for Sunday service. Naomi stepped through the entrance, her uniform drawing immediate attention. Conversations stuttered, eyes turned, and a few council members shifted visibly in their seats. She didn't acknowledge. The stares didn't blink. When a man in the back muttered something about playing soldier, didn't respond. When a woman near the front leaned toward her friend and whispered, "Isn't that the one from Oakwood Lane?" Instead, she walked straight to the podium, heels clicking with a measured calm, and waited for the council chair, a round man with thinning hair and a nameplate that read H. Culver, to acknowledge her. "You're not on the agenda," he said, without looking up. Naomi spoke evenly, her voice low but unmistakable in its resolve. "I won't take long, but I believe the community needs to hear this." A few murmurs rippled through the audience, and Councilwoman Angela Bird, the only black member on the board, tilted her head and nodded slightly. "Let her speak, Harold," she said. "We've heard enough silence lately." The chair huffed but leaned back. 3 minutes. Naomi stepped forward, placing both hands on the wooden ledge of the podium, her posture upright, her tone deliberate. "My name is Gunnery Sergeant Naomi Harlan, United States Marine Corps, retired. I was born in this town. I was raised on its streets. I served 23 years overseas so that the people here, my neighbors, could live without fear of abuse, injustice, or silence." Someone coughed near the back, but the room had quieted the kind of silence that doesn't come from politeness, but from people realizing too late that they've underestimated the one standing in front of them. "Last week," she continued, "I was handcuffed, slammed against my porch, and slapped in the face on my own property. No warrant, no explanation. Just 2 officers drunk on power, responding to a call that never existed. I was treated not as a resident, not as a citizen, but as a threat." She paused, letting the weight of the words settle. "And I am not the first." From her inside coat pocket, she pulled a small folder and placed it on the podium. 5 names, 5 complaints, all buried under insufficient evidence. "I have read their stories. I have spoken to them in person. The patterns are clear, and the message is clearer. If you are black and live in the wrong zip code, you are assumed guilty before you even open your mouth." Councilman Raines, a real estate developer who prided himself on never raising his voice in public, leaned forward. "Do you have proof?" Naomi didn't flinch. "I have recordings, I have testimonies, and I have the scars on my face, which I didn't receive overseas, but on a quiet Georgia morning at the hands of the people paid to protect me." She reached into her back pocket and held up her phone, thumb hovering over the screen. "Would you like to hear them call me a liar? Would you like to hear the slap echo off the brick of my house?" A hush fell across the room, so complete it felt unnatural, like a church just after someone drops a plate. "I didn't come here to play audio," she said softly. "I came to remind you who you serve. The badge is not a shield from accountability, and the silence of this body, this council, is not neutrality, it is complicity." Councilwoman Bird's eyes met Naomi's and held there, and in that glance was the quiet nod of recognition shared by people who had fought different wars but carried the same scars. Naomi closed the folder, placed it down, and stepped back from the podium. "I'll be submitting all of this formally, to your offices, to the press, to the Department of Justice if necessary. Because if justice won't come from within, it'll come from pressure without." The chair tried to respond, stumbled over a sentence about procedural channels and decorum, but no one was listening anymore. The room had turned. Conversations broke out in low murmurs. A few claps came from the back, and then louder, more deliberate applause began to rise. Not orchestrated, not planned, but real. Naomi didn't linger. She walked down the center aisle with the same calm she'd entered with, ignoring the cameras, the phones, the council members now whispering furiously among themselves. Outside, the air had grown warmer, the clouds beginning to break apart into strips of white that stretched across a pale blue sky. She took a long breath and looked up, not with hope, not with despair, but with the quiet clarity of someone who had made a move they couldn't take back and wouldn't want to. Behind her, the doors of the municipal building closed with a hollow echo, but Naomi didn't turn around. She adjusted the strap of her uniform jacket, loosened her shoulders, and walked across the sun-warmed pavement like a woman who knew exactly where she stood. Not in their favor, but firmly on higher ground. Word spread faster than Naomi expected, not in headlines, not yet, but in front porches, beauty shops, and Sunday dinners, where people still measured truth by tone and not by the screen. By the following week, she couldn't walk into Lou's diner without someone pausing mid-bite to nod in silent recognition. And when she filled her truck with gas, even the high school kid behind the counter said, "My grandma told me about what you said to the council. She said you spoke like a preacher with a badge." Naomi didn't respond with more than a soft thank you because she didn't come for applause, but she also knew silence sometimes came with its own kind of danger. She felt the shift in the air, not fear exactly, but that electric tension that lives in small towns when people start asking questions long buried under concrete and routine. On Thursday, she got a call from Regina Taylor, a local neurosurgeon she hadn't seen since high school, whose name had appeared in 3 separate complaints in the folder Naomi had shown to the council. "They stopped me again," Regina said flatly. In scrubs. On my way to the hospital. Same two cops. Same questions about where I was going and who owned the car. Naomi didn't ask if Regina filed another report. They both knew by now what good that did. Instead, she said, "Come to the meeting Saturday night. We're gathering at Bethel Baptist. Reverend Green is opening the hall." There was a beat of hesitation on the line, then Regina's voice tighter this time. "I'll be there, but don't think they're not watching. I've seen the same patrol car pass by my house 3 times today." Naomi didn't flinch. "Let them watch. They've already shown us what they are." By the time Saturday came, the church basement hummed with quiet energy, the kind of atmosphere Naomi remembered from briefings just before a raid. People filed in slow but steady folding chairs, scraped softly against the tile floor, and no one smiled too broadly because everyone carried something, an incident, a memory, a name that hadn't made it into a folder because telling it out loud still felt dangerous. Naomi sat near the back, not at the podium. She didn't want to lead from the front this time. She wanted to listen first. Reverend Green stood near the chalkboard with a notepad in hand, his glasses slipping slightly down his nose, the room dim except for the overhead fluorescents flickering, every so often like the building itself wasn't quite sure how to hold this moment. Regina spoke first. She didn't pace or raise her voice. She just told the room about being stopped 4 times, in less than 3 months each time, more aggressive, each time ending with her being let go without explanation. Last time, she said, he asked if I stole the car. I was wearing my hospital badge, had a surgical kit in the trunk, and still I had to explain myself on a street where I've lived for 8 years. Next came David Williams, a retired music teacher who had spent 40 years at the local high school. His hands trembled slightly as he recounted the night officers banged on his door because someone reported suspicious music. He'd been playing jazz records. He remembered one of the officers looking past him into the house asking, "You live here alone, Mr. Williams," like it wasn't a question so much as a warning. By the time the 6th person had spoken, the room had fallen into a rhythm, not of outrage, not yet, but of release. Of finally saying it all out loud into shared space where no one interrupted and no one questioned the validity of the pain. The youngest voice came from a college student named Tyrell who wore a gray hoodie and sat with his hands folded between his knees like he was afraid of taking up too much room. "They stopped me because my taillight was cracked," he said. "Searched my car, made me sit on the curb, didn't find anything, never said sorry." No one needed to ask which precinct the officers came from. When Reverend Green finally turned to Naomi and asked if she wanted to add anything, she stood slowly, not with fire but with that steady presence she'd carried through combat zones and negotiation tables alike. "What you're describing isn't random," she said. "It's a pattern. And patterns, when repeated and allowed, become policy. They stop being mistakes. They become the culture." Someone murmured agreement near the front. A woman pressed a handkerchief to her mouth and nodded. Naomi continued, "The silence they count on, it's been broken. What happens next isn't about just one person. It's about all of us deciding what kind of town we're willing to live in." After the meeting, the church hall didn't empty quickly. People stayed behind trading names and numbers, sharing side conversations, pointing out patrol routes, connecting stories they hadn't known were linked. Regina leaned against the coffee table and whispered, "You know they're going to push back harder now." Naomi gave a small, tired smile. "Good. That means they're afraid." Outside, the heat had broken. A late breeze rustled the tree branches as people stepped into the parking lot, and somewhere nearby a mockingbird called once, then fell silent. Naomi lingered by the church steps, watching the last of the group climb into their cars. Some glanced around cautiously before starting their engines. Others didn't look back at all. When Reverend Green joined her on the steps, he didn't say much, just handed her a folded paper. Inside was a short list of names, people who hadn't spoken but wanted to next time. Beneath it, someone had scrawled in neat script, "They can't ignore all of us." Naomi folded the paper, tucked it into her coat pocket, and looked up at the night sky. It was dark and wide and clear, the kind of southern night that felt ancient and vast, like it remembered things even when people tried to forget. She wasn't sure what the next morning would bring. But tonight, for the first time in weeks, the weight on her shoulders didn't feel like a burden she carried alone. It felt like the beginning of something that couldn't be undone, something solid, something rising. The message came at 2:14 a.m. when most of the town was asleep, and the sky outside Naomi's window glowed faintly with the quiet blue haze of the moon. It was a short text. No sender ID, just a number she didn't recognize, and a file attached to video time-stamped from a dashcam she hadn't known existed. She sat up in bed slowly, not startled but alert, like her body still remembered what it was like to wake from shallow sleep in unfamiliar territory. The air was cool in the room, her window cracked slightly, and the only sound was the soft hum of cicadas pulsing from the tree line beyond her fence. She watched the footage twice before moving, once to absorb what it showed: two officers, her officers, standing outside their cruiser on the night they cuffed her, laughing about putting the old lady in her place. The second time to be sure it wasn't altered. The voice that called her a mouthy vet was unmistakable, as was the slapping sound, clearer now than it had been in memory. At the end of the clip, one of them muttered, "That's the kind of lesson you don't forget." He was right, Naomi thought, standing barefoot on the hardwood floor, her jaw tight and hands loose at her sides. She hadn't forgotten, and now neither would they. By mid-morning, she was sitting in Dr. Marcus Chen's sunroom, the windows thrown wide to let in the smell of fresh grass and jasmine, a tray of untouched tea sitting between them on the glass table. Marcus had become an unlikely confidant over the past week, an old neighbor, a local cardiologist, and someone who understood the weight of dignity in quiet places. He watched her carefully, arms folded across his chest, the edge of his white coat still dusted with flour from the bakery where he'd picked up breakfast. "I don't want this going viral," Naomi said, plainly turning the phone so he could see the paused image. "Not yet. Not before I know who sent it." He nodded slowly. "Then we work backwards." It turned out the file had been uploaded through a secure drop site, a method used by whistleblowers, journalists, and anyone afraid of the official channels. Marcus tapped the screen a few times, muttering to himself as the sun shifted through the windows, casting bright lines across his hardwood floors. "This kind of thing doesn't just appear," he said. "Someone inside gave it to you. They want you to have it, but they're scared." Naomi nodded. "They should be." The video became the first piece of hard evidence in her hands, more than testimony, more than bruises, and it confirmed something deeper than misconduct. It confirmed intent. The officers weren't reacting. They were executing a pattern. They weren't shaken. They were amused. That evening she met with Zoe Franklin, a civil rights attorney from Savannah who had offered her help after the town council meeting. They sat across from each other at Naomi's kitchen table, documents spread out between coffee mugs and notebooks, the air filled with the scent of burned toast and lavender cleaner. Zoe was sharp, quick-witted, and direct, the kind of woman who wore confidence like a tailored blazer and could quote federal statutes without looking them up. She tapped the edge of the video with a pen. "This is gold," she said. "And it's also a warning. Whoever gave this to you is trying to do the right thing without burning themselves alive." "Any idea who?" Naomi asked. Zoe shrugged. "You've rattled the department. Someone's talking. Quietly maybe, but it's starting." Naomi looked out the window past the backyard where her father once built her a swing from an old tire, now half buried in weeds. Good. They should know we're not going away. That same night, just after sundown, a knock came at her door. Not a pounding, not the kind that demanded fear, but cautious, like someone unsure of how welcome they'd be. Naomi opened it slowly to find a young officer in plain clothes, her face pale under the porch light, her hands stuffed deep into her jacket pockets. "Officer Morales," the woman said quietly, almost apologetic. "I shouldn't be here, but I have something you need to know." Naomi stepped aside and let her in without asking. The kitchen light spilled soft yellow across the table as Morales sat her back straight, but her voice trembling just slightly. "I've seen the reports disappear," she said. "I've heard them laugh about it, about you. They think it's over." Naomi didn't respond right away. She let the silence stretch, let it say what her mouth didn't need to. "You're the one who sent the video." Morales didn't deny it. "I don't want to be part of it anymore." "You still are," Naomi said gently. "But that can change." Morales slid a flash drive across the table. "This is everything I could get without being noticed. Internal memos, quota breakdowns, citations by zip code. It's a system, and you're not imagining it." Naomi picked up the drive, held it between her fingers like a tiny key to a larger door. "Then we're going to open this all the way." As Morales left, Naomi watched her walk carefully down the driveway, her shoulders hunched against more than the wind. It struck her then how many were trapped people inside a broken structure, unable to speak but desperate to be heard. She turned off the porch light and stood in the quiet for a moment longer, listening to the soft rustle of leaves and the low hum of the neighbor's television through the open window. The night was darker than usual, moonless and thick, but it didn't feel suffocating. It felt honest. Back inside, Naomi set the drive next to the others, pieces of a puzzle she had only just begun to assemble. She moved with purpose, now her steps measured her back straight, her mind sharper than it had been in years. There was no turning back. Not with what she knew, not with what had been entrusted to her. And as the clock ticked toward midnight and the cicadas quieted for the night, she sat at her table with the light overhead, flickering gently, hands folded on the folder that bore her name, and waited not for permission, but for the next move she already knew was coming. It started with a sound she couldn't name, part splinter, part gasp, waking her just before dawn, like a whisper that broke itself on the wind. Naomi sat up instantly, not panicked, but fully alert, her body moving before her mind caught up, honed by years of instinct that never quite retired. The room was dark but not quiet, and somewhere beneath the drone of insects outside, she heard the sharp creak of the floorboards by the back door, a sound she knew shouldn't be there. She reached under the bed and pulled the lockbox open with one fluid motion, fingers closing around the cool grip of the pistol she hadn't held since Kabul, her breath steady and shallow as she rose barefoot to the hallway. She moved like memory, slow, precise, each step placed with the care of someone used to clearing rooms in the dark. The kitchen light flickered faintly through the crack in the doorframe, and when she pushed it open, she felt the sting before she saw it. The back window had been shattered, glass splayed across the tile like frozen rain, and under the flickering fluorescent above the sink she saw what they had come for. Her medals, gone. Not her laptop, not her safe, not the valuables tucked behind cabinet walls, just the row of framed commendations she'd mounted on the wall above her desk, with quiet private pride. The wall looked naked now, the hooks dangling loose like broken teeth, and the sight of it struck her harder than she expected, like losing a part of herself she didn't realize could still be taken. She walked toward the damaged, slowly crunching glass under her feet, the sharp scent of vinegar and old wood filling the air where the humidity had begun to creep in. Her hands didn't shake as she dialed the local precinct, but her voice was cold when she said, "This is Naomi Harlan. I've had a break-in. You might want to come see it before I clean up the mess." The officers didn't arrive for nearly an hour, and when they did, they came with the casual disinterest of men sent to tick boxes on a report, not solve a crime. One of them, a boy, really no older than 25, scribbled notes on a pad, while the other wandered through the living room without permission, pausing to glance at the pictures on her shelf, like he was waiting for something to interest him. She watched them both with arms crossed, jaw clenched, and when one finally asked, "You sure nothing else was taken?" she didn't bother to hide the exhaustion in her reply. "They took my service medals, Purple Heart, Navy Commendation. Do you think they'll pawn those, or just burn them?" He blinked clearly, unsure if she was being sarcastic or dangerous, then muttered something about probably just kids, and scribbled that onto his notepad too. When they left, she stood in the silence for a long time, staring at the wall that used to hold the symbols of everything she'd earned. Not for glory, not for show, but for survival, for duty, for sacrifice. And now stripped from her like a statement she hadn't signed but still had to answer for. Zoe arrived that afternoon, the fury in her voice barely restrained as she stood by the broken window shaking her head. "They didn't even dust for prints," she said. "Didn't ask for security footage from your neighbors. They're not investigating this, Naomi. They're warning you." Naomi didn't argue. She just moved to the sink, poured herself a glass of water and sipped it slowly before speaking. "They know I'm not afraid, so now they're trying to make me tired. Are they succeeding?" Naomi looked at her with something halfway between a smile and a scar. Number. But the retaliation didn't stop there. That night, her inbox was flooded with anonymous messages, some threatening, some vulgar, all unsigned. One contained a photo of her parents' bakery taken from a low angle at night, headlights off headlights, waiting. The next day, her mother called, voice tight and cautious. "2 men came in today," she said. "City inspectors. Said we had code violations, things that haven't been a problem in 20 years. Naomi closed her eyes for a long moment, pressing the bridge of her nose with 2 fingers. "I'll take care of it, Mama." "You already are," her mother said, "but you need to know, they're not just coming for you anymore. That night, Naomi sat at her desk, the gaping holes where her medals had been now filled with quiet paper files and a map of patrol zones she'd been building piece by piece. She added new pins, new names, new dates, every incident, every call, every neighbor who had come to her with a story they'd been afraid to tell. The evidence was growing not just in weight but in shape. It was beginning to look like something undeniable. Later, as she locked the doors and turned out the lights, she paused in the hallway outside her father's old room. She hadn't touched it since coming home, hadn't crossed that threshold since the funeral, but tonight she opened the door, stepped inside, and stood in the dim stillness, like a soldier returning to familiar ground. On his nightstand, beneath a thin layer of dust, was the dog tag he'd worn every day after Vietnam. The chain rusted, the numbers faded but still legible. She picked it up and held it in her palm for a long moment, then slipped it over her head, letting the metal settle against her chest. The weight of it was small but grounding. It reminded her that what had been taken didn't define her, but what she chose to carry forward always would. And as she stood by the window watching the street below where a car idled a little too long before turning off its lights and driving slowly away, Naomi didn't reach for her weapon. She didn't flinch or retreat. She simply watched her posture, calm her breath, even the dog tag warm against her skin. They could take things, they could break glass, they could rattle doors, but they hadn't learned the first rule of war. You never win by scaring someone who's already walked through fire. The courthouse was quieter than Naomi expected, its limestone steps still warm from the midday sun, the flag outside barely shifting in the August heat. She stood at the bottom for a moment, hand resting lightly on the railing, watching a group of men in khaki uniforms, smoking and laughing under the shade of a dying magnolia. They didn't notice her, at least not yet, and for a few seconds she allowed herself the stillness before walking into the lion's den with her shoulders square and her jaw set. Inside, the air conditioning was turned too high, and the receptionist at the security desk barely looked up as Naomi slid her credentials across the counter and said, "I'm here to file a formal complaint with supporting evidence." The woman blinked once scanned the card and gestured toward the elevator. Third floor, Office of Professional Standards. Suite 309. The ride up was slow, the kind of slow that wasn't mechanical but deliberate, like someone had decided justice moved better one floor at a time. When the doors finally opened, Naomi stepped into a hallway lined with beige walls, the kind that made people forget what sunlight felt like. She walked past a framed photo of the police chief shaking hands with a congressman, both smiling like old friends at a country club brunch, and reminded herself this wasn't about smiles, it was about systems. Zoe met her at the door, her hair pulled back and a thick binder cradled against her chest like armor. "You ready for this?" she asked. Naomi nodded once. "I've been ready. They're the ones who should be nervous." They spent the next 2 hours inside a sterile meeting room seated across from 2 men in suits and a woman who scribbled everything down without looking anyone in the eye. Naomi laid it all out: dates, locations, witness names, incident reports that had been altered or disappeared entirely. She played the video from Officer Morales, handed over the internal memos, the breakdown of quotas, the spreadsheets with color-coded patterns that made discrimination look like nothing more than accounting. When she finished, one of the men, gray-haired mid-50s badge clipped to his belt, cleared his throat and said, "We'll take this under advisement." Zoe leaned forward, her voice cool and clear. "That's not good enough. We're not asking. We're reporting. And if this stays buried, we go federal." He didn't blink, but the tightening of his jaw said more than any words could. Back in the parking lot, Naomi exhaled, slowly gripping the steering wheel of her truck without turning the engine over. She watched the sun crawl toward the horizon, the courthouse steps bathed in orange light that made everything look deceptively peaceful. "They're stalling," she said quietly, "trying to buy time until the heat dies down." Zoe adjusted her sunglasses, glancing sideways. "Then we turn it up." The next morning, the Savannah Journal published an op-ed written by Regina Taylor laying out her own experiences, citing dates, badge numbers, and the dismissive behavior of internal affairs. She signed it with her full name, title, and hospital affiliation. That same day, 3 more residents added their names to a growing complaint filed with the city's Civilian Oversight Board. Names Naomi had once only seen whispered on paper, now printed in ink. Then came the call from Channel 4 News. "We'd like to speak with Miss Harlan," the voice said. On the record, Naomi hesitated, her thumb hovering over the edge of the receiver. She had avoided cameras up to this point not because of fear, but because control of the narrative mattered more than spotlight. Still, she knew this moment would come, the one where her voice would need to carry beyond council meetings and basement gatherings. She said yes. The next day they met at Dr. Chen's house, choosing the back patio for its privacy and the morning light that filtered through his tall oaks in broken ribbons. The reporter was younger than she expected, maybe 30, with kind eyes and a steadier hand than most. He let Naomi speak without interruption, just nodded as she recounted the slap, the cuffs, the retaliation, and the quiet war that had followed. She chose her words with care, not theatrical, but measured the way truth should be delivered, undeniable, not dramatic. "I didn't ask for this," she said, voice steady. "But I won't look away from it either. This isn't about revenge. It's about repair." When the segment aired 2 nights later, the town shifted. You could feel it in the way people lingered longer at the grocery store, how they whispered in gas station lines or stared a second too long at passing cruisers. Signs began to appear on porches, "We believe her." Someone printed shirts that read, "No more quiet streets." A local pastor used her story in a Sunday sermon about courage and consequence. And a retired officer from a nearby county wrote a letter to the editor calling for accountability from within. Not everyone agreed. Naomi expected that. A truck parked across her house one evening with its lights off and engine idling just long enough to be noticed. The bakery her parents owned was tagged with a slur the next morning, but the words were scrubbed off by volunteers before noon, and when her father opened the shop at dawn, someone had left fresh flowers on the front step. That afternoon, Naomi met again with Morales in a quiet corner booth of a diner 2 towns over. The young officer looked more exhausted than she had weeks ago, but also more certain, like someone who had chosen her path and no longer second-guessed the terrain. "They're talking about suspending me," Morales said softly. "Administrative leave pending review." Naomi stirred her coffee, eyes fixed on the sugar swirling through the liquid. "Let them. If you fall, you won't fall alone." Morales looked at her, voice barely above a whisper. "They think you're bluffing. That you'll get tired. Walk away." Naomi smiled, not out of humor but out of something deeper, resolve hardened by time and testing. "They've already taken what they thought mattered. Now I'm only left with what I'm willing to fight for." And with that, the silence between them wasn't heavy. It was full. It was the sound of ground shifting under tired boots and firm steps. The kind of silence that comes before thunder. The kind you don't mistake for peace. Naomi stood to leave her coat, folded neatly over her arm, her shoulders aligned, eyes clear. As she pushed the door open and stepped into the bright afternoon, she didn't feel victorious or vindicated, just steady. Like someone who had chosen to stand in the storm, not because she couldn't walk away, but because she knew that standing there mattered more. And outside, the breeze picked up scattering dust across the sidewalk, carrying with it the scent of something turning old weight, loosening old power being named. 6 months later, Naomi stood at the front of the police academy auditorium, a room filled with bright uniforms, polished shoes, and faces that still carried the sheen of idealism untouched by years on the street. The walls were lined with flags and framed oaths, and the overhead lights buzzed, faintly softening the edges of the tension in the room. The podium before her was modest, a plain wood stand with no seal or insignia, but to Naomi it might as well have been a post on the front line, because what she was about to say mattered as much as anything she'd ever said in a war zone. She adjusted the microphone with one hand, the other resting lightly on the edge of the lectern. Her posture relaxed but upright, the years of military bearing never quite leaving her frame. She scanned the rows of cadets, slowly letting the weight of her presence settle into the silence, before speaking, not to intimidate but to ground. "I know you've all studied policy," she began, her voice calm and even, "and I know you've memorized laws, codes, and procedures, but none of that matters if you don't understand what your badge really means." Her voice echoed gently through the chamber, not loud but steady, and the cadets straightened in their seats, sensing instinctively that this wasn't just another speaker ticking a box on their training schedule. "That badge doesn't make you powerful," she continued. "It makes you responsible for every person you stop, every voice you hear or don't hear. And responsibility," she said, letting the word linger, "is heavier than a weapon because you carry it when no one's watching." There were no slides, no prepared statements, no talking points. Just her words, her eyes, and the stories she carried in the marrow of her bones. She told them about the woman who had been pulled from her car on the way to surgery, handcuffed with no explanation, and left to miss a procedure that cost a life. She told them about the retired teacher who was questioned for playing jazz too loud on a Friday night, and the boy in a hoodie who was told to sit on the curb for a cracked taillight and a face someone didn't like. And then she told them her own story, not as a cautionary tale, but as a mirror. "I came home after 23 years in the service," she said, "to find that my uniform meant nothing when I wore jeans and a sweatshirt. I was slapped, cuffed, and told I didn't belong in my own neighborhood. Not because I was doing anything wrong, but because someone looked at me and decided I wasn't the kind of person who belonged on that block." She paused, letting the quiet stretch out just enough for the truth to land. "They didn't ask my name. They didn't ask what I'd done. They just assumed. And that assumption is what breaks trust, not violence, not mistakes. Assumptions. She could see it on their faces, some leaning forward, some fidgeting slightly, others wide-eyed in the way young people are when they realize the world doesn't wait for their readiness. "The hardest thing you will do in this job isn't running toward danger," she said. "It's pausing long enough to ask yourself whether you're seeing a threat or a human being, and whether your fear is based on truth or habit." She let that settle, then shifted her stance slightly, softening the intensity in her voice, but not the clarity. "You will be tempted more than once to believe that loyalty to your fellow officers comes before loyalty to the truth. It doesn't. And the day you protect a lie because it came from a friend's mouth is the day you stop serving the public and start serving the system." Someone in the back coughed. A pencil tapped against a notepad. Outside the window, a breeze rustled the flag just enough to lift the edge of its cloth. "This department is changing," she said. "And you are part of that change. Not just in policy, but in practice. Not just on paper, but in parking lots, street corners, front porches. That's where this work lives. That's where people decide if the law is something that protects them or something that hunts them." Naomi stepped back from the microphone, letting the silence return. She looked at the cadets not as a crowd, but as individuals, one by one. Some were nodding, some were still a few, seemed uncomfortable, and that was fine with her. Growth often started in discomfort. She gave one last nod, her voice now lower, more intimate, like someone speaking across a kitchen table. "Remember this, every person you meet is someone's child, someone's partner, someone who's been hurt before and is hoping you won't be the next wound. You get to decide every single day whether your presence makes the world safer or smaller." With that, she stepped away from the podium and let the applause rise behind her, not thunderous but sincere, not performative but earned. As she exited the auditorium and stepped into the sunlight outside, Naomi squinted up at the sky and let the warmth settle across her face. The academy building behind her buzzed faintly with energy like a hive just beginning to understand the work ahead. She didn't turn back to look. She didn't need to. Her job wasn't to stand behind them. It was to remind them what stood behind that badge. And with that, she walked to her truck keys in hand boots, quiet on the pavement, and drove back into the town she'd once wanted to forget, but had now helped reshape with nothing more than truth, persistence, and the memory of a slap that started it all. Sometimes the battles we fight don't happen on foreign soil. They unfold quietly in our own neighborhoods on sidewalks we've walked for years. Naomi's story reminds us that courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it looks like standing alone in front of power and saying, "This is wrong." For those of us in our later years, it's a powerful call to remember dignity doesn't come from titles or uniforms. It comes from knowing who you are even when others forget. We've lived long enough to see how silence can protect the wrong people, and how speaking up, especially when it's hard, can protect the right ones. This story teaches us that true change doesn't begin with noise, but with someone refusing to accept what's easy over what's right. Whether you're a veteran, a teacher, a neighbor, or a parent, your voice matters more than ever. And when you choose to stand firm, you're not just defending yourself, you're making the world a little safer for the next generation. If this message spoke to you, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs to be reminded that standing up still matters. Your support helps these stories reach the people who need them most. S.2S